Well, Netflix, eBay, Uber and IBM, those are just some of the few technology companies that have landed here in Africa recently, obviously in a pursuit of growth. And even Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg has set his eye on the continent's tech scene. Now, the vast opportunities on the continent have also grabbed the attention of 500 startups. And many local tech enthusiasts were pretty excited to learn that the annual Geeks on a Plane tour was finally coming to Africa. Now, in studio to tell us more is Monica Brand-Engel, and she is a partner at Kona Capital. We have Hanan Abdal-Magid, who is the CEO from Cameliza, Paul Ark, who is a managing director of the corporate venture capital, and Scott Wu, who is a partner and head of investments at Omidyar Network. Joining me in the studio right now. Guys, thank you so much for joining us, for making some time to be with us here at CNBC Africa. Now, Paul, let me kick off with you. So I understand that you guys have been to Nigeria and you've been to Ghana. For those of us who weren't able to be there, tell us about the experience you had in those countries.
Well, it's been a very comprehensive experience. Although the purpose of the tour is a technological tour of the ecosystem, we were exposed to a wide variety of different areas of both countries, whether it be the culture, arts, performances, Nollywood, as well as a wide variety of food. So I think it was a very, very good overview, an immersive experience in both of those countries.
And then, Scott, I understand that the South African leg did kick off yesterday, finally. How was that?
Oh, it's fantastic. I've been here, I think, 4 times previously. Always enjoy coming back to South Africa. We, as an investment firm, the Omidyar Network, has been investing throughout the continent for over a decade and have a small presence here in Johannesburg.
So not your first time to the continent, but I understand it's your first time in South Africa. What brings you here exactly in terms of the opportunities that you're seeing in the region? Tell us what you're seeing.
So I actually used to live in South Africa, and we've made 3 investments here. The Kona Capital, the firm I co-founded and manage, it does venture focused on fintech for the unbanked. And it actually is a market in addition to West Africa. We have, through our sponsor, a hub in Accra. We have the largest microfinance bank in Nigeria called Action Microfinance Bank. And all of these companies, all of these investments are part of a theme that we see where there is an enormous market opportunity. There is this emerging middle class who is demanding quality and access to traditional financial services. So for us, South Africa is the real fintech hub. West Africa has been sort of a more traditional financial services hub, and we just see the opportunity in Africa as enormous and exciting.
And the fintech space here in South Africa is growing and it's receiving a lot of attention, this I know. But before we actually get into some of the opportunities and some of the returns that maybe you're seeing in that space, I'd like to speak with you, Hanan, because this is your second time on the Geeks on a Plane tour. And I understand that you were in the Middle East there. So just tell us about how the 2 experiences there and in Africa compare.
There is a common element in the experience, which is it's very immersive. So you get a taste not only of the business side of things, you get a taste of the culture, you get a taste of the people. It's very engaging. So that's the common part. In Africa, the interesting part for me is Egypt is part of Africa. And actually, I decided to join this tour because I attended last year the World Economic Forum. And I was in Cape Town, and it was very vibrant with very relevant issues that I personally live every day: the health, unbanked, banking for the unbanked, and the different the education issues that we have. So a very vibrant discussion, very similar. So I'm decided to kind of join on this tour and learn a bit how people are addressing the problems from different perspectives.
And Paul, you mentioned Nigeria. Now, Nollywood is actually one of the sectors there that is actually doing really, really well. And your focus is on the tech space. But there's a lot of challenges in terms of tech in Africa, infrastructure being one of them. But Nigeria is a really difficult economy to be in right now with what's happening with the oil price and all of that. So how do you plan on finding opportunities there?
Well, the purpose of my trip is a little bit less directed than my colleagues on this trip. I work for a fintech fund that belongs to Siam Commercial Bank out of Thailand. So in Thailand, the startup ecosystem is actually quite young. In fact, there are probably a lot of parallels economically. There's some differences, but a lot of similarities in certain aspects between some of the economies in Southeast Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa. So, this is less of a trip to find specific investments in the fintech space and more to understand, the technology scene in the various countries, the state of financial services, how Africans on the ground are interfacing with their finances, oftentimes without the use of a financial institution, but often with the use of a smartphone. So it provides a lot of parallels and a lot of learning lessons that we can use in Southeast Asia. And so, my mission is more really to understand what's going on here. Is there something that we can learn? Is this something that we can use to adapt our strategy? And then perhaps make a follow-up return to Sub-Saharan Africa and see if there are technologies that are unique to this region that we could port over to Thailand and utilize there.
And Scott, you mentioned that this is your 4th time here in this country. I'm interested, have you made any investments here as yet? I mean, Monica did share that she has around 3 so far, but you, 4th time here, what have you done?
Yeah, so my prior visits here was not in the capacity of a partner at Omidyar Network, but Omidyar Network has been investing throughout the continent and in South Africa for over a decade. We have, I think at my last count, we've made 40 plus investments over the years here in South Africa.
Where exactly?
It's across the board. So Omidyar actually is unusual in that we fund both nonprofit organizations and for-profit organizations for the purposes of addressing an impact goal. And so the vast majority of our activities here has been on the nonprofit side, building up schools, school networks. We have an education tech investment in Siavula. We have a job market, online job market in Giraffe. We've invested in ecosystem players like Code for South Africa, Simodisa, and R Labs, and so it's widely spread. We're trying to build up the system and ecosystem here to really support entrepreneurism and to spawn the next wave of startup activity.
Yeah, and most definitely. And entrepreneurism is actually what South Africa really needs, because we have a high unemployment problem. But you guys must have seen all the news recently surrounding the politics here, our finance minister potentially being ousted of his position. As an investor, we hear a lot that, investors don't really like a lot of negative news surrounding the political field. How are you feeling about putting more money into the country?
That's a great question. So, like Scott, Action, now more recently Quona Capital, the company I manage, has been investing in the region for about a decade. The 3 investments we have a company actually along with Omidyar, it was called Zona, which is down in Cape Town, as well as Yoko, a mobile point of sale, and our most recent investment here in Johannesburg with All Life, an insurtech company. And we are in here for the long haul. So the way we look at, and I should also mention we're a global fund. So like Hanan said about, and also Paul, about the connections, Quona means something in every region where we work. And that's relevant because we do believe there's connections. We believe there's connections and learnings and actually what we call reverse innovation. So an innovation, like All Life, for example, that was born and raised here in South Africa, they're actually now insurers in the UK and in the US that are interested in exporting it. And so we believe that there's going to be a transfer in technology, a transfer in knowledge. There's definitely going to be blips. So the RAND reflected what the market thought of what's happening with the finance minister just yesterday. But we believe that we're not in this for short term. We are here for long-term market potential, long-term value creation, and we think South Africa, along with Nigeria and Ghana and Kenya, are phenomenal markets.
And Hanan, do you share this view? Oh, Scott, I saw that you wanted to add something there.
Oh, I was just going to also reiterate that as an investor, stability is key. And one of the reasons why you've attracted so much foreign investment in South Africa is it's a stable hub throughout the continent. And so that's always very important when investors are looking to make long-term investments, place staff, seed employees or station employees, stability, the ability to have a stable monetary system and both get your money in and get your money out, that's all critical. And so I can't say that it's not a factor in our thinking.
No, most definitely. So Scott is talking about stability. Monique says she's in it for the long haul. But Hanan, you just tell us there, what would you like to see in a country where you put your money in terms of the political field and the regulation?
So I'm from Egypt, and I'm also an entrepreneur turned investor. So throughout my journey, I've seen that it is tough but possible. So I'm a very strong believer that there's a playbook for our environment. You just have to embrace the volatility and all the changes that are there, and kind of, I call them, develop some cushions to survive throughout these volatilities and succeed. I totally believe also part of my passion for investment and for accelerating the young talents is like, I totally believe that technology is maybe for the more mature countries is like more convenience, but for us it's like a necessity so that we can take a leap into a higher quality of life. So definitely I'm all for investing in our markets.
Most definitely, and I actually touched a bit on regulation with you, Hanan, but perhaps in closing comments, Paul, you can share there. A lot of global companies that come here speak about our regulations, talking about too much red tape in getting businesses off the ground. In terms of preempting that from the guys that have been here before, how do you think you would potentially get over this challenge if there is something that you do see here that you want to come back for?
Well, let me preface by saying that my focus, investment-wise, is slightly different than my colleagues here, because we're as the fintech arm of Siam Commercial Bank, we have more of a strategic mission, which is really to identify technologies that would ultimately be relevant to the bank. So, as much as we would invest in a local market, the intention is ultimately to help grow a startup or a technology to the point where it would be attractive to a financial institution as a customer, namely either my own or other banks around the world. So to the extent that we find a local entrepreneur in an African market or European market or Latin American market or wherever it may be that has a technology that is very critical for the operations of a financial institution, that is perhaps our most important metric. To the extent that local regulations make it easy for that startup to thrive in their home market and get the traction they need to survive, growing into the international market, that's important. It's a bit indirect. So I think that's a bit of a long answer to say that we do keep an eye on stability, the regulatory regime in a lot of these countries. But at the end of the day, what we're looking for is we're looking to create an additional market or channel for startups that are looking to go beyond South Africa or Nigeria or Ghana.
I would add, though, that I think South Africa has a risk of losing its leadership position as the technology center of Africa. I mean, we saw in Nigeria and Ghana, there's a lot of incentives that governments are trying to do to attract investors. You have Rwanda, which has been described as the Singapore of Africa. I mean, exchange control red tape is something we face all the time. It creates liquidity and it actually hurts the companies. So I do think, looking at the rules and regulations from the point of view of the entrepreneurs in Africa, as well as the investors that want to support them, I think it's really important to have South Africa to maintain its all the advantages that we've described. I think it's a competitive environment among African countries.
Most definitely, I share the same sentiments. But thank you so much for your time. We're going to have to leave it there. Now, doing business in Africa is no child's play, and a lot of global companies that have come here have been burnt. And although a strategy is essential for survival, it does not necessarily guarantee success. Now, we find out how the venture capital fund plans to succeed here with Asher Siddiiqui, who is partner of 500 startups. Monique Woodard, their venture investor for Sub-Saharan Africa, is also with us, as is Bedy Yang, their managing partner rather. Now, Asher, let me just start off with you. So give us insight into what your Africa strategy is, because navigating on this continent, it is not easy.
Absolutely. So our Africa strategy is in its inception phase. It's in the earlier phases. However, we're an active investor in Africa. Monique has been leading the charge in making investments, about 10 investments across Sub-Saharan Africa already. And what we're doing right now, as part of our Geeks on a Plane tour of Africa, is getting a better feel, a better understanding of the African experience, the African environment, the startup ecosystem. And so that's been a fantastic experience for us. I think you've spoken to some of our other geeks that have accompanied us. And now, as we develop that further, what we find is that there are some developmental challenges and some barriers that are limiting the ability of of the startup ecosystem. And so what we're doing is to support Monique in her drive to find attractive investment opportunities. Bedy, who's our managing partner, who actually has a strong focus on developing ecosystems across emerging markets, is actually now beginning to focus on developing the ecosystems across Sub-Saharan Africa. And that will actually support the ecosystems, create a better startup ecosystem, which will then lead to better quality deal flow.
So Monique, just give us more understanding of some of those barriers that you are facing in developing startups.
Sure. So we've been investing on the continent for about 2 years. We've done 10 investments here in Africa, most of them centered in Nigeria, but also in Ghana and South Africa and Kenya. And some of the things that we're challenged with when we go into those markets is a lack of local capital from angel investors or downstream capital from other more mature institutional investors. So we invest at seed stage, but we also need other investors to come into those deals with us. So we need local capital to be deployed as well. So that's one of the challenges. The other challenges are more related to the way that these countries are developing, and it's about infrastructure. It's about the deal structure, whether investors are comfortable taking minority stakes in companies rather than asking for a majority of the company, because that is the way that we believe that we invest successfully in tech companies. So we're looking at all of these different factors that happen in these emerging markets and really trying to figure out what are the challenges, but also what are the opportunities. Where do the opportunities lie for us to have a hand in developing the ecosystem so that it is very attractive for other investors like us to come in and start investing heavily.
I can understand why capital is a challenge there in Nigeria, because many South African companies are actually struggling to get the capital that they put in out currently because of the forex controls there. But please just share more insights into, I know that the Geeks on the Plane tour has been around a number of countries. There's 30 if I understand correctly. Obviously, the culture and language also poses a barrier. And you know, the African continent is very diverse in its culture and the languages that are spoken. Thankfully, English is one, but there are others. How do you intend to overcome some of the cultural and language barriers here on the continent?
Yeah. We're definitely not afraid of the diversity component. Like if you think about our investments, only on the portfolio we have 1,700 investments, and then we have also been in about 50 countries. And like even across the team members, we speak 20 languages. I think the overlap of those languages with the African language, unfortunately, it's quite low. But
hey, you're Portuguese speaking. There's some Portuguese that's spoken.
We have Portuguese and English, so some overlap there. But I do think like the way we really operate is to partner with sort of local entrepreneurs, local ecosystem builders, because that really help us dive deeper in the market. We don't really believe sort of coming from the US or Silicon Valley, there's a lot of resources. We think a lot about how do we transfer those network and resources here and work with the local network. So when you think about Geeks on a Plane, we're looking at a few things, right? We're looking at market. So whether that's sort of ripe or ready for us to come in. We're looking at money, and the money component is we are coming into venture capital. That's a new space, normally in a lot of emerging markets. Going back to what Monique was bringing is, do we have co-investors? Do we have downstream investors? Can the business sort of build out the trajectory until their exit? Is there sort of liquidity to that market? So the money component flow, that it's also quite important. And then I think the third component is really the managers who are going to be the people who are going to be driving our local initiatives. And we've seen that happening. That's how I got involved actually with the institution with 500 startups. We started doing Geeks on the Plane, and now we have over 100 investments in Latin America. We have over 100 investments in Southeast Asia, and we can really see the development, like we're already covering Middle East, so there's no reason really for us to not be here, and definitely not afraid of diversity. We think that actually really adds to the component of success.
Most definitely. And Asher, let me just bring it back to you now. So I do understand that you have a number of dedicated funds for the vast continents that you do invest in. Just tell us about the potential development maybe of a fund that's dedicated towards Africa. Is something like that in the pipeline?
So we're obviously at the early stages of developing our strategy. But we do believe that as the ecosystem develops, which we see that there's a great deal of opportunity. So just taking a step back. So we see Sub-Saharan Africa, huge opportunity. So, but we see that there's a gap between us being able to deploy significant amounts of capital today. So what we're doing is a two-pronged strategy. Monique will continue to invest in startups, in opportunities across Sub-Saharan Africa. That'll keep that momentum going, and then in parallel our ecosystem development teams will be developing ecosystems in West Africa, in Southern Africa, in East Africa, in these pockets, and figuring out how we can help them to go beyond those challenges and find workarounds, and we see that 2 to 3 year process will then lead us to a place where we think that we'll be in a good shape to
dedicate specific funds. But let's actually talk about or drill in more into that money aspect. Monique, so how much has been invested on the continent so far, and what are you targeting in terms of dollars?
So our average investment in companies, whether they're here in Africa or in the US, is roughly $150,000. So we've done 10 or so deals, so that's just over $1 million. So we're really looking to figure out how to deploy more capital in the market, and that may take the form of a Pan-African microfund. It may take the form of a West African microfund and a South African microfund and an East African microfund. So there are lots of different ways that we could potentially address the market. And you really have to think very clearly about the way that you do address the market, because West Africa is very different from East Africa. It's very different from South Africa. A lot of non-African investors come into the market and they kind of view Africa as this big monolith, but it's actually incredibly diverse, and it takes a very different strategy as you're moving from country to country.
It is such a relief to hear an American say that, because I'm really tired of watching the movies that have, oh, I went to Africa as one country.
So we're really thinking very clearly about the ways that we could potentially address all parts of the market that make it good for us, that make it good for our LP investors, that make it good for later downstream investors. And this Geeks on a Plane trip is part of that exploration. It's sort of a fact-finding mission. And we also selfishly bring other people along with us, because we want other people to invest along with us and get really excited about those markets as well.
But in terms of some of those investment risks, what are the major risks of investing here in Africa?
I'll tell you a little bit how we think about risk. We actually believe, because we're in the venture space, majority of our companies are not going to become successful. So we know that in our portfolio, only about 2% of the companies are going to generate a good portion of that return. Normally we talk about like 50x of the return, and then another percentage, which is another 5%, that's going to be 20%, right? So on the 90% of the business that we invest in, so as we deploy more capital here, we have 10 deals, we're looking at 50, 100 deals. We know majority of the companies are not going to be able to make it. So we really take the approach to the risk into the modeling. Like we don't do like individual evaluation to say this specific company and then concentrate that portfolio, right? So when we look at the risk, we are actually quite risk taker in terms of thinking about what is the failure rate, and that's built into how we do the investment. That's part of our investment thesis, and that's also how our investors support us on like sort of deploying the capital. And at the same time, what we are a little bit obsessed is finding the unicorns, right? So that those sort of billion-dollar companies that will make sort of for the rest of the portfolio. But deploying, one thing that is really important that we feel as we come into all the markets that we've been into is just have more sort of risk appetite and then be deploying that. So we are not that afraid in terms of risk, but I do think the regulatory component and investors not taking a lot of the equity into the company so that you can help other investors from outside to come in and build the companies and maintain the entrepreneurs very motivated. Those are like culture side of like building the company that I think it's really important. So I think a lot of the important side of us thinking this market to continue, it's the culture component, right? And we can provide that platform of saying like we really build that bridge to the rest of the world.
Most definitely. And just to, you'd like to add something?
Sorry, I wanted to just add something. So absolutely. So we're not just a venture capital firm. We're what I call a full stack VC firm. So we have arguably one of the best accelerators in the world. We run the top 3 accelerator in the world in Silicon Valley. We get the best deal flow. We have venture capital funds. We have 4 VC funds that are global funds, and then we have several micro funds across the world. And then we have an ecosystem development piece. So what we find is that 70% of our deal flow, 70% of our investments are actually US based, but 30% of our investments are actually global. And what we find is that that percentage is increasing as we continue to develop. So Bedy started this 4 or 5 years ago. And so what we see is that within certain emerging markets, so Bedy spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and we've got 40 investments in the Middle East. We're actually in the process of closing our first fund, but we've already made 40 investments in the Middle East. And what we've found in places like the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Brazil, is that it wasn't just us coming there on Geeks on a Plane. That was the starting point of a discussion, of a conversation. But what we do is we run investor programs. So educating investors, angel investors, people who want to create their own VC fund. They fly over to Silicon Valley. We run programs at Stanford, at Berkeley, at 500. The people who wanted to develop accelerators, we run an accelerator program. I love it. We work for an American company, so we come up with the sexiest names. So this is called BAM, Bootcamp for Accelerator Managers. But what we're doing is we're developing the ecosystem at such different levels. So it's not just at the entrepreneur stage. We're going to the capital level, and we're saying, we will educate you. Because obviously, you know, myself, I come from a late stage background. When Dave and Bedy told me that we've invested in, at the time it was like 1,600 investments, and 60% of them failed, that was scary. So it took me time to understand that yes, 60% of those are failed, but the remaining, you know, we have a portfolio, a massive portfolio, where some of our investments, 20 to 30% of our investments, actually just give us our money back. But then it's that minority of investments that give us those returns. However, the deeper I went into it, the more I understood it, I realized it's a quantitative strategy. It's making a lot of small bets, and it actually works. Our portfolio, our performance is actually directly correlated with the global venture capital industry. So we find that, you know, today we have 4 unicorns in our portfolio. We have 40 Centaurs in our portfolio. Centaurs are companies that are valued anywhere between 100 million and just a dollar below $1 billion. And we have 400 ponies. Ponies are companies that are valued anywhere between $10 million and just under $100 million. That is an amazing success story.
It is. You were right about the names there in America. And I take it you lose some, but there's obviously great potential to win a lot more. But guys, thank you so much for joining us here in studio. We're going to have to wrap it there, and all your best in your ventures of finding investment opportunities here on the continent and getting those investors to put their capital through. Thank you.